In episode 12 of Bleach the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Masaki begins to Hollowfy as she succumbs to White's Reiatsu. Urahara helps Isshin bind himself to her soul in order to save her life, while in the present day, Isshin tells Ichigo the truth behind his mother's death. First and foremost, before we begin the review, Happy New Year! I hope I got my timings right with that one, as at the time of recording it's not quite the new year yet, but by the time this video goes live, I reckon it should be 2023, which is very exciting. And so as you can see, I'm finally back home. I've got the usual background behind me again. Thank you for bearing with me during the Christmas period as I tried to get the live reactions for episodes 12 and 13 out. And as always, thank you for the continued support you showed me and the channel during 2022. It is greatly appreciated. And this year also promises to be a fantastic one for us Bleach fans as well. Of course, we've got the Thousand Year Blood War arc part 2, The Separation, coming in July, which I know everyone is looking forward to. But before we can get to any of that, first, we have to wrap up part 1 with our in-depth, comprehensive spoiler reviews of both episodes 12 and 13. Before we can get to the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well in order to help support me and the channel. If you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And I want to give a massive shout out and a huge continuous thank you to everyone supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate your support. And of course, as we do each and every week with our in-depth spoiler reviews, we'll be taking a look at the episode from the perspective of someone who has read the entirety of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, so expect potential spoilers for the entirety of that arc as we move forward, as we take a look at what the episode added, changed, and even took away from the source material. So, without further ado, let's take a look at episode 12, the penultimate episode of part 1, titled Everything But the Rain, June Truth. This might be shorter than our average spoiler review, as there of course won't be any predictions section this week for obvious reasons. And as always, before we dive into the actual spoiler analysis itself, first we have to look at what this episode covered, and I was actually surprised to see that it doesn't really cover that much. It feels like it crams a lot in once again to cap off Everything But the Rain before we can move on in episode 13, but in actuality, this episode is kind of hitting that 4-chapter sweet spot again. And so the chapters covered in this week's episode are as follows. The second half of chapter 533, Everything But the Rain 6, The Gravitation, 534, Everything But the Rain 7, Whole of Reproach, 535, Everything But the Rain 8, Defenders, 536, Everything But the Rain 9, June Truth, and of course the title of this week's episode, and finally 537, Everything But the Rain 10, the last Everything But the Rain chapter, Prinz von Licht. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. It feels like rather than splitting it almost directly down the middle, they crammed a little bit more of Everything But the Rain into episode 11, presumably because they really wanted to end it on that cliffhanger meeting between Isshin and Masaki, where they come together for the very first time, which of course, in my opinion, makes complete and total sense. And as far as I'm concerned, Everything But the Rain worked out almost perfectly in the anime adaptation. So the episode opens then with the second half of chapter 533, following on almost directly from the end of last week's episode. We get the same captain's meeting here that we get in the original chapter, almost down to a T, with Isshin being pulled up in front of the other captains to take responsibility for his unauthorized trip into the human world. And of course, this is just a really cool moment because we're seeing the captains here showcased in a way that is almost identical to how they appear in the Soul Society arc, the very first time we as readers actually met these characters. And it's interesting because we actually get to see a couple more captains here than we did in chapter 533. For example, captains like Seijin Komamura and Kenpachi Zaraki, confirming that they were both captains around 20 years prior to the main storyline. So in that sense, this is a really cool moment. However, I have a difficult time looking past the fact that Komamura's design is almost completely incorrect here. Not only should Komamura be wearing at least some kind of disguise, it doesn't necessarily have to be his armored helmet. It could just be some kind of cloth covering or something like that. We've seen him wearing numerous different designs at some point in time, but we know for a fact that he doesn't decide to remove that disguise until deep into the Soul Society arc. So not only should Komamura have some covering over his face at this point in the story, but he's also actually wearing his time skip outfit as well. He doesn't look like this until after the Aizen battle. So they've really totally screwed Komamura's design here, but other than that, the rest of this scene looks fantastic. It's really cool getting to see a captain's meeting in normal daylight in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, because so far they've been these kind of dimly lit atmospheric meetings. Here it feels a little more casual, despite the fact that Isshin is effectively on trial, although of course he gets away with it absolutely scot-free, because this is of course a softer, more mellowed out version of Yamamoto, which I feel like Kubo was really trying to hammer home here. But it's just really nice to get to see these captains in all their glory, as of course, other than Komamura, this scene is drawn very well. It looks absolutely lovely. This is of course the final time we actually got to see both Yamamoto and Urahara within the confines of the Bleach story, so it's nice to see them here. Yamamoto especially looks fantastic. As Yamamoto gives Isshin something of a dressing down before eventually letting him off the hook, Mayuri's snide remark about failing to retrieve the remains of this mysterious hollow being the real crime is kept in here intact, except this time Kyoraku looks totally serious as opposed to kind of sheepishly glancing at him. But for the most part, these early scenes are very accurate, very faithful to the source material. Of course, Yamamoto seems to think that Isshin is leaving something out of his report, but of course Isshin keeps Masaki's existence to himself. We then move over to Masaki as she is in the middle of a school day, looking wistfully out of the window, thinking about Isshin, thinking about the fact that she should have at least gotten his name before he went back to the Soul Society. That is all exactly the same as it appeared in the original chapter. And as well, Isshin resting in his barracks, thinking about Masaki, thinking about how amazing she was, how it took guts for her to not only take on White herself, but then also introduce herself as a Quincy to Isshin, despite knowing he was a Shinigami. All of that, again, exactly the same. The admiration he feels for her, and the earliest stages, those earliest sparks of their bond being formed are exactly the same. And as we close in already on the end of chapter 533, some of Masaki's dialogue with her school friends has been slimmed down from the original chapter. Her friend Kanan's line about how living with Ryuken under the same roof must be very exciting has been cut from the episode, as is her other friend Shiho's only line about how even if they weren't cousins, Ryuken wouldn't be Masaki's type. That's totally gone as well. But as Masaki suddenly feels that poisonous rippling effect of the Hollow Reiatsu creeping through her veins, she stumbles into none other than Urahara Kisuke, of course ending chapter 533 as he senses something wrong with her soul, and there's of course a dark look upon his face. An extra line is actually added in here for one of Masaki's classmates, as they mention that perhaps Masaki falling into Kisuke is a new method of trying to meet people. But as we begin chapter 534, the opening scene featuring both Rangiku and Hitsugaya is cut from the episode entirely, and we don't actually see these characters ever again in the Everything But the Rain flashback. In that original scene, Rangiku appears to be approaching Isshin's office with some kind of phony explanation in an attempt to goof off, only to find that Isshin has already returned to the human world, leaving her only a note, letting her know she's in charge. Enraged, Rangiku kind of throws it at the wall, but Hitsugaya says that both she and Isshin are very similar. That's all totally gone from the episode. Now, when Masaki returns to the Ishida household, her conversation with Aunt Izumi is again basically exactly the same here. Izumi, of course, having been told about the events of the previous night by Katagiri, scolds Masaki for breaking Quincy law and assisting a Shinigami in battle against a Hollow, where of course we know the Quincy are commanded to wait until a Shinigami has already been killed before actually stepping in, so as not to reveal themselves, and of course to minimize any chance at potential injury. Masaki tries to lie her way out of it, but of course it doesn't work. Interestingly, in the original chapter, Izumi is considerably more aggressive in her approach with Masaki, storming towards her, grabbing her by the arm and kind of grappling with her as she berates her for breaking law, for the fact that they've taken her into their household, and she repays them with this kind of bad behavior. In the anime, Izumi kind of just stands there, and although she's angry, the air is not quite as tense, not quite as desperate as it felt in that source material. However, Ryuken's confrontation with Katagiri remains basically intact, and I'm pretty happy to see that. Basically, the three major scenes that these two characters have together in Everything But the Rain were all left essentially totally untouched, and I really like that. Although Ryuken and Katagiri's relationship is not really important, it's not a major factor of this flashback arc, it is a cool, understated relationship, and I'm glad the anime gave it the time to breathe that it actually deserved. It means the payoff later in this episode can be felt to the fullest degree. Of course, Ryuken yells at Katagiri saying, you know, I told you not to say anything to Mother, there was no issue the other night, you shouldn't have said anything, it wasn't your place to, but Katagiri stands up to him basically saying, but there was a problem, Masaki was bitten by that hollow, which means there could be serious consequences down the line for the pure-blood Quincy lineage of the Ishida family. And this is of course pretty cool because it shows that Katagiri is thinking about the concerns that she thinks Ryuken has. She's thinking that Ryuken wants this, and even if he can't see it, she will do it for him. She will carry out his wishes even if he hasn't asked her to do so. It kind of just shows how devoted Katagiri is, not only to the Ishida household as their kind of maid, their servant, but how devoted she is to Ryuken himself. This is all basically exactly the same as it was in the original, except there's a brand new shot added of some bloodied clothes spilled out onto the floor, which I think is just supposed to show that Katagiri was in the process of cleaning Masaki's clothes, the clothes she was injured in, when Ryuken came barging in. But as the sinister, toxic Hollow Reiatsu overwhelms Masaki and she collapses to the ground in the grand hall of the Ishida mansion, interestingly Aunt Izumi's Quincy cross is clearly visible around her neck. This isn't something I actually noticed back in the original chapter, however it is there, only a little more obscured. But as a worried Ryuken rushes to Masaki's side, he sees that terrible gaping hollow hole opening up within her chest. Of course, the hollowification process has begun. Masaki doesn't have long left. Terrified and unsure of what to do, Ryuken takes Masaki up into his arms and flees the household, taking off into the sky, desperate for some kind of help. Izumi chases after him, shouting for him to come back, saying that he can't be near her, he can't be near that thing, as they have no idea how dangerous Masaki has actually become. As Izumi screams after her son, Ryuken of course totally ignoring her as he takes off across Karakura town, we can see interestingly that Izumi has suffered some kind of a wound to her leg in the past that Kubo chooses to emphasize. This wound of course is very familiar. It looks like an injury sustained by a hollow. It looks almost identical to the same injury Orihime sustains extremely early in the series. So I mean, what does this really mean? We don't really know anything about Izumi as a character, but we can probably glean from this that she is at least some kind of a hypocrite. Now of course she won't have undergone hollowification to the same degree that Masaki is currently undergoing now, or else Izumi wouldn't be here today. However, the fact that she has been injured by a hollow at some point in her life to the point where she has actually sustained a scar of that magnitude implies then that probably in the eyes of the Quincy, she must be considered a gemished Quincy now, a mixed blood or impure Quincy, and a potential threat to their pure blood lineage, to their survival. Maybe this is why Soken isn't around much anymore. He doesn't want to be near her because he considers her to be this kind of tainted blood being that he has no choice but to be with, and maybe this is why Izumi feels so strongly about the situation and about Ryuken going away with Masaki in this condition as well. But as Ryuken ignores her cries and continues to fly away, Izumi stays back, stays within the safety of the doorway and quietly, solemnly hangs her head. It's a small, understated moment of sadness that I've always found to be really interesting. Why doesn't Izumi go after him? Why does she look so defeated, so dejected? I can't help but wonder if she is either unwilling, due to her strongly held beliefs that the Quincy shouldn't put themselves in any kind of unwarranted danger. Maybe that's why she doesn't chase after him, or maybe she's unable to due to the injury on her leg. Either way, with her son having left, ignoring her cries, and her husband nowhere to be seen despite the severity of the situation, it does seem like the Ishida household is slowly crumbling and falling apart. But as Ryuken kind of chastises himself for what's happening to Masaki, how he blames himself for the state she's currently in, an enormous hollow suddenly comes out of nowhere, blindsiding Ryuken and almost manages to eat him until it's cut in half by none other than Isshin Shiba, who arrives right on time. Although Isshin saves him, that very Kyoraku line he has where he says there's no need to thank him as he's not interested in gratitude from guys, is cut from the episode. But as a seething, almost violently enraged Ryuken with madness in his eyes turns to Isshin and starts screaming at him, saying, why does Masaki have to go through this? Why does she have to be in so much pain? It's only because of you. It's entirely your fault that she's going through this. Their argument, their conversation is word for word identical to how it appears in the original chapter, which I think is, of course, crucially important. It's a big moment. But of course, Urahara arrives in the nick of time, telling them to stop their pointless argument. All three of them now gathered together for the very first time. In the lore, this feels like a really awesome, really important and poignant moment, the coming together of three characters entwined by destiny like this, as Urahara says that he can offer them a choice that will allow them to save Masaki's life. Of course, this ends 534. As we begin chapter 535, a brand new shot at the very start of this chapter kind of follows the camera as it falls, as it descends into the cavernous blackness of the hollow hole, and then we transition into the actual chapter itself. But it's a cool way, I think, of visualizing Masaki's rapid descent, that she is quickly falling, hurtling towards hollowification, and we see her almost celestial soul-like body drifting through this dark, blank canvas, almost peacefully, as if heading into an eternal sleep. It's honestly a kind of creepy moment, I think. We see this peaceful Masaki drifting presumably through what is her own subconscious, her own soul, and as she opens her eyes, she sees nothing but the monstrous skull-like visage of white forming within her very soul, hollowification quite quickly, rapidly overtaking her. In the Urahara shop, as the rain hammers the ground outside, Kisuke reveals that the symptoms that Masaki is experiencing are the exact same ones that he himself has been researching for the last 100 years. Both Isshin and Ryuken are unsurprisingly pretty shocked to hear this, but Isshin's line, saying how Urahara must be slightly older than he looks, is cut from the episode. Unfortunately, when they ask who he is, Urahara's short pause before revealing his identity is also cut, but thankfully, when he finally tells them his name, Isshin's alarmed reaction is left in the episode. But as Kisuke begins to go into his in-depth explanation as to what hollowification actually is, the episode shows us various flashbacks from Turn Back the Pendulum. Considering we're now in the 1,000-year Blood War arc, and the concept and idea of hollowification doesn't really play a massive role anymore, it's not a major focal point of the story, it's really great and fantastic that we got all the exposition we did here about hollowification itself, as in my mind it really helped to solidify this concept overall, and combining what we know here with what we see in Turn Back the Pendulum really helped to make everything make more sense in general. And as Kisuke goes on to explain the phenomenon of soul suicide, where a soul that has been hollowified can no longer retain that necessary balance in order to survive, they self-destruct. It really does feel like that is what happened to White in episode 11, once his body was destroyed beyond repair, once its structural integrity was gone. Whatever balance Aizen had created through hollowification between, presumably, the Shinigami soul and the hollow soul was completely lost, and White's body just detonated, or more specifically, White's core is what swelled up and detonated. Presumably that is where those souls were intertwined, where they intermingled. And suddenly, when that balance was gone, that soul just violently erupted. That seems most likely to be what happened as far as I'm concerned. And while I know this isn't a particularly popular opinion anymore, as it does kind of go directly against what happens in Can't Fear Your Own World, the explanation we get there, I do still believe that at least back in the Irankar arc, this is what Kubo was doing with Tozen upon his death. Tozen at that point is of course a hollowified Shinigami, his body containing both hollow and Shinigami Reiatsu, contained within a delicate balance, and when Hisagi severely mortally wounds him, his body can no longer sustain that balance, his structural integrity is damaged, and his body self-destructs via soul suicide. That always made so much sense to me. I know Can't Fear Your Own World says that Aizen mercy kills him, and fair enough, that's fine. But with this current explanation from Kisuke, it's only renewed my opinion that this is what Kubo was doing with Tozen, at least back in the Urankar arc. It's handled slightly differently here, but the general gist of Isshin not really being able to follow along with Kisuke's explanation is kept in the episode. It's just unfortunate that the small shot of Isshin with a very Ichigo-like expression on his face is removed. But overall, I'm glad they did keep Isshin not really understanding anything about what's going on. It was a nice small piece of additional character for Isshin, and it helped differentiate his response from Ryuken's, who was clearly very capable of following along. Now, as I mentioned in my live reaction, Kisuke's pretty in-depth explanation of hollowification, soul suicide, and the vaccine he created in order to stabilize victims of hollowification is pretty unusual for Bleach on the whole. It's a massive info dump, a huge piece of exposition that the series doesn't really do that often, but it was really awesome to see. It's changed up ever so slightly here in the episode. I feel like while they kept the vast majority of the explanation, they kept the kind of core of Kisuke's explanation intact, they definitely seem to try and streamline it, I think, or at least make it a little more overt what's actually going on, with a couple of additional lines here and there. That being said, there are some parts of Kisuke's overall explanation that have been removed here as well. For example, in the original chapter, Kisuke states that his vaccine made of human souls and Quincy arrows had a 100% success rate when it came to saving the Hollowfied Shinigami from dying to soul suicide, thereby effectively turning them into perfect Vizards. And we know this because the chapter shows them when he mentions it. But the anime changes the line to say that the soul will simply remain in the state that it's in, before adding a new line about how Quincy's, unlike Shinigami, have no resistance to hollows, and therefore the vaccine alone isn't enough to save them if they've been hollowified. I think the anime is basically just trying to streamline the explanation to make it a little clearer. At one point, Kisuke literally says we're trying to counteract and neutralize her hollowification with an opposing force. Another new line that reinforces this is added later when Kisuke reveals the choice is down to Isshin. He explicitly says Masaki is becoming a hybrid of Quincy and Hollow, and therefore would need a hybrid of human and Shinigami nearby to balance her soul, something Kisuke can turn Isshin into using a new Gigai he's developed. Of course, the crux of this explanation remains the exact same to how it is in the original chapter. It needs to, because this is a vitally important story point, but it just feels like the anime has made the wise decision of adding a couple more slightly overt, slightly more explicit lines and terms in here to make it just a little bit clearer. A very small piece of exposition is actually cut after Ryuken's internal monologue, where he kind of thinks to himself that there are so many disadvantages to this state that Isshin would be in, there's no way he's going to go for this decision to give up his Shinigami powers, to give up his life in Soul Society, and live out a life in the human world in order to protect Masaki. What's cut here is Kisuke continues his speech, saying Isshin won't be able to leave the Gigai, and this will continue until her soul and the hollow within her are released from those threads that Kisuke will use to bind them. However, a new line is added in the anime here as well, where Urahara says that her hollowification will actually be passed down to her descendants as well, of course, foreshadowing, implying what will happen to Ichigo. Regardless, Isshin agrees to go along with the procedure to save Masaki's life, utilizing that same reasoning that she once espoused to Ryuken in order to justify going to Isshin's side. Ryuken perhaps realizing the two of them are meant to be together as they echo the same sentiments about protecting other people, about putting other people's safety and well-being ahead of their own, lowers his head. Throughout the entirety of the Everything But the Rain storyline, Ryuken has been talking about putting the safety and well-being of the Quincy line of the Ishida family lineage ahead of the individual. And I like this because the story never explicitly says that Ryuken is in the wrong for choosing to put the well-being of the Quincy bloodline first, ahead of the safety of any particular individual, but it does imply that despite their arranged marriage, he and Masaki could never be. As she and Isshin exhibit that same sense of morality, that same sense of caring about others, that selflessness, rather than hiding to preserve some kind of bloodline, Ryuken realizes that's the truth, that's the way of things, that's how things have to be. As the ghostly, helpless form of Masaki now hurtles towards Whitescaping, more hollowification imminent, a spiritual version of Isshin arrives within her soul to defend her, ending chapter 535. As we begin chapter 536 with Isshin staring down White's gigantic disembodied head, his joke about how his earlier quip telling White not to lay a finger on Masaki makes no sense when talking to a big head is cut, and Isshin launches a Getsuga Tensho at the hollow spirit, destroying it completely. In the anime, his Getsuga is shown to be a fiery blast, which is awesome as it lines up with what we now know his Shikai Engetsu to be, though considering his sword appears to be in base here and not Shikai, it does seem to counteract the earlier appearance of him using a Getsuga Tensho while in base form against Aizen during the Irankar arc. The following comedic interaction where Isshin kind of yells at Masaki for being so nonchalant about the fact she's totally naked is then cut from the episode, and as she breathes again, Urahara reveals the process was a success and Masaki will in fact be alright. This is all the same as the original chapter, except Masaki kind of blushes in her sleep and starts saying her lines from the page that was cut from the episode, where she goes on to ask Isshin his name. Her blushing doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense here, I think. The original joke in the chapter was that she's blushing because he told her off for being naked and not caring about it, but since that interaction is missing from the episode, it feels a bit weird. Isshin's comedic moments as well, where he continues to scold her in her sleep, is also cut as well. But as a dejected Ryuken leaves in the rain, feeling as though he has failed, Katagiri meets him and consoles him, and in a way, reveals her own feelings for him. This scene is exactly as it appears in the original chapter. Like I said, basically everything regarding Ryuken and Katagiri is left intact, which I'm really, really happy about. I think it's a fantastic scene, and in my opinion, it perhaps embodies the motif of the rain better than anything that has come before it. Ryuken is at his lowest point, pretty much we've ever seen him, and the rain is coming down harder than we've pretty much ever seen it. It's a really quiet, somber, solemn moment between two characters that don't get an awful lot of screen time, but I think it really helps to solidify their relationship and how they eventually ended up coming to be. Katagiri really does have these extremely deep feelings for Ryuken. We even get the slightest flashback to when they both met as children, which is such an awesome thing to see. I just think that this scene is great. I'm very happy that it played out exactly as it did in the original chapter as well. But yeah, on the whole, I'm a big fan of this scene. I think it packs a surprisingly emotional punch. I like that there's almost a subtle twinge of the gothic to this scene as well. Katagiri standing there in the darkness, in the rain with her umbrella. But I like the fact that there is that emotion. I like the fact that she begins crying as she can't bear to see the way Ryuken is feeling, and how this must have really shaped Ryuken as a character, as a man, moving forwards. But after this, Isshin kind of begins a follow-up explanation that basically just now takes us almost through a montage of some of their later years as they build into a relationship together, and we kind of fly through almost like a whistle-stop tour of some of the events of their life that kind of followed. Basically, we find out that Masaki ended up leaving the Ishida household once she graduated from high school, as her soul was mixed with the Hollows. The line stating that the final decision to effectively expel Masaki from the Ishida household was in fact Ryuken's, as Isshin speculates it was his own way of letting her go, is unfortunately cut from the episode. And it is interesting to think as well that Izumi, despite having apparently suffered a wound from a hollow herself, was allowed to stay, and so with Masaki being forced out into the big wide world after having sustained this injury, it kind of makes you wonder, did the Ishidas actually want to protect the Quincy lineage, or just their own? But it is interesting to think that Isshin took Masaki's last name for himself fairly quickly, as of course he opened the Kurosaki Clinic way before presumably they were even married. It seems likely he probably did it to try and stay under Soul Society's radar. But as Isshin continues to provide us with a flyby of the years of their relationship, he talks about how he initially lied to Masaki about what happened to his Shinigami powers, how they were stripped from him and he was banished from the Soul Society due to unlawfully coming to the human world. He explains that he figured Masaki probably didn't believe it from the very get-go, but a small lie like that didn't matter to either of them in the end, as they were kind of just happy to have each other. Of course, here we get some additional and truly lovely scenes that we don't get to see in the original chapter, such as the two of them enjoying an extended lunch together, or even a slightly extended version of the two of them at the cinema. As Isshin explains that Masaki was like the sun and he enjoyed being in her orbit, which of course is a metaphor that has been used to describe this character in the past. It's a really nice callback. It is a shame that the original art of that is missing, as that in itself was also a lovely callback to considerably earlier in the series. But the anime seems to be taking this moment, the ending of Everything But the Rain, in a much more serious way, removing a lot of the overall cutesy nature of their romantic relationship, and instead turning Masaki into an almost ethereal, angelic figure gilded by the sunlight on the riverbank. Since we associate Masaki with a riverbank anyway, thanks to her flashbacks with Ichigo, I kind of think this is a nice touch, and I actually quite like this version. I also think that when Masaki kind of turns to face the camera with the sun beating down behind her, watching her hair move in the wind, the animation there was really incredible. But as we return to the present day, Isshin explains why his Shinigami powers returned after 20 years. The appearance of Ichigo's hollow during the perennial battle against Byakuya signified that Isshin's own power and that lingering reishi thread that was still connected, that still bound Isshin to the hollow white, was no longer able to suppress it, and so the connection Isshin had to both the hollow and the Gigai was broken. But then Isshin says that he will tell Ichigo now the real reason Masaki was killed that day, and that brings us to the end of 536. So considering this episode does only cover about 4.5 chapters, which as I mentioned previously, I do think is the kind of sweet spot for the adaptation, there's an awful lot to cover here because this is such a dialogue and story heavy section of Bleach, of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. It's unlike really anything else we've ever had before. There is so much being told to us here, densely packed right into these last few chapters of Everything But the Rain. It really is absolutely vital stuff for the overall story and the world of Bleach. Now at this point in the episode we've reached the credits, but of course there is another scene to come. Now in previous reviews I have bemoaned the almost ridiculous length of some of these post-credit scenes, but this one absolutely takes the cake. An entire chapter, 537, takes place after the credits for some unknown reason. But as Isshin says Masaki shouldn't have died that day, Ichigo's line regarding what Urahara told him during the first invasion about Bloot is cut. In fact, a fair bit of this chapter is cut, actually. Isshin explaining that because Masaki was so skilled in Bloot, the wound she suffered from White garnered quite a lot of attention, presumably because he was strong enough to actually injure her, where no other Hollow managed it since. Also cut is Isshin saying he chose not to go and help her, as he could sense Masaki's Reiatsu, saying that without his powers, he wouldn't have been able to do much anyway, but he would have still gone to her side if he felt she needed it. Isshin goes on to explain that, Grand Fisher had this unique skill to disguise itself as a lure, but Masaki still shouldn't have had any trouble. I mean, all of that is basically totally cut from the episode. It's kind of interesting because it explains that although Isshin can't see hollows in this new Gigai, he can still at least feel Reiatsu, even from as far away between his house and the riverbank. Which I always found to be a little bit weird, because I feel like saying he can't feel Reiatsu at all at this point in the story better explains some of the weirdness surrounding some of those earlier chapters. For example, did Isshin sense Rukia arriving at their home in Chapter 1? Did he not sense Fishbone D coming towards their house? All of that is a little bit strange, and honestly, if Kubo had just said Isshin can't feel Reiatsu at all, I think it would have made more sense. But at the end of the day, I suppose the most obvious answer to this particular query is that this is the same kind of Gigai that Kisuke would later administer to Rukia, and so in the 9 years that have passed since Masaki's death, Isshin's powers, whatever was left of them, continued to dwindle until by the time we reach the present day, the start of Bleach, they had basically gone entirely. So who knows, maybe that's why this line is gone from the episode. But I will say the anime gives us what I really wanted from this chapter back in the day, and that's a new and extended look at the showdown between Masaki and Grand Fisher. It is awesome seeing Grand Fisher again as he moves to strike her, looking as creepy as ever, and Masaki kind of prepares her blute ready for his strike, only for it to fail immediately before her eyes, which of course is just so cool to get to see that all play out, to see how and why she actually died on that day. Isshin asking Ichigo about Uryu and his mother, explaining that Uryu's mother was none other than Kane Katagiri, and that she collapsed and fell seriously ill on the very same day Masaki died, is also surprisingly cut from this week's episode. But of course, Isshin here reveals the truth, that Masaki died because she lost her powers in that very moment, thanks to Yhwach stealing the powers of all Quincy's he deemed to be impure across the world. As Isshin explains this, as he begins to give us our first recital of the Kaiser Gesang, the Quincy hymn about Yhwach himself, we get a brand new shot of Ryuken discovering his father's journal under the bridge where Uryu was a few episodes ago. So clearly Ryuken is at least kind of onto what's going on with Uryu, but of course, as we saw a few episodes back, he is too late to do anything about the fact that Hashwolf has already come for his son. The journal depicts the Alsvalen, making it look pretty terrifying, to be honest. It's really awesome seeing these ancient depictions of the Quincy, of their original battle against the Shinigami, and it just helps give Yhwach himself this much more mythological, legendary feeling, which I think really adds to the sense of gravitas this character has, but also makes him just that much more terrifying and abject. It's really cool seeing him with his arm outstretched as these Quincy are depicted effectively giving their lives for him, but it's also really cool to see at least several of those Quincy having been turned to skeletons. While no explanation is actually given for this yet, it's nice to see at least that they are foreshadowing that this can happen. But because Ryuken is by the river in this moment, we then don't get to see him in his office staring out at the moon as Isshin continues to recite this Quincy hymn, which is a bit of a shame because it's an awesome shot, especially with that picture of Katagiri on his desk behind him, but the anime has a nice compromise, I think, showing a slightly different picture with Katagiri and Uryu together instead. It adds a bit of surprising humanity to the otherwise usually cold and distant Ishida family. But there's some amazing imagery here of Yhwach standing in a pool of blood, making him look very, very sinister, as Isshin explains that Yhwach's blood flows within the veins of all Quincy, as of course Ichigo realizes, yes, this means him as well. But now with Isshin's explanation finished, with Ichigo's resolve hardened, with the revelation that Yhwach, this new primary antagonist for this final arc of Bleach, is behind at least the death of his mother, the rain finally begins to clear as Ichigo has a much firmer, much clearer understanding of who he actually is and where his powers have come from. Everything has come full circle. Isshin and Masaki's story has been told, and at the end of it, we know for sure who the true target is, who the true villain is, who not only ruined Ichigo and his family's lives, but also Uryu and his families as well. With a steeled expression on his face and a fire burning in his eyes, Ichigo thanks his father for finally telling him everything, finally telling him the truth, and the two of them step outside the house, of course the rain having now let off. Outside, Ikumi is there waiting for Ichigo, giving him back his substitute Shinigami badge, and as he receives it, he says he's finally ready to go. While this is almost the end of chapter 537, the big cliffhanger reveal at the end of this chapter is moved to next episode instead. When I saw that it wasn't here in this episode, I really thought my prediction that they were cutting this reveal entirely to do a 2-in-1 reveal at the end of next week was actually going to come true, but I wasn't quite right. But with that, that does bring us to the end of episode 12, the penultimate episode of part 1 of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, titled Everything But the Rain, June Truth. The preview poem for episode 13, The Blade Is Me, shows Zangetsu and actually features the poem from volume 61 exactly as it appears there. It reads, "I believe the world is full of danger. I want to protect you from it, only because inside me is the same impulse as that danger." Of course, foreshadowing the big twist reveal that would come in the season finale. Of course, like I said at the start of this video, there's no predictions this week as we already have episode 13, so I'll see you next time for our in-depth, comprehensive spoiler review of the season finale of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc part 1, the blade is me. As for this episode, I do feel like it's being overlooked a little bit because it came out alongside that bombastic season finale that everyone was so looking forward to, but I do still love this episode as well. It's emotional, it's thoughtful, and it gives us major answers we have been waiting many, many years to hear. So I liked episode 12, and to be honest, I really enjoyed how they depicted everything but the rain in the anime, especially at the end there, as they were able to tie into those additional scenes we've had of Uryu so far in the anime. So let me know, guys, in the comments below, what do you think of episode 12, and also what are your overall thoughts and feelings on everything but the rain as it appeared in the 1000 Year Blood War Arc anime. But I really hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you next time for the review of the season finale of the 1000 Year Blood War Arc. Until then, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.